Thanks everybody for being here. I'm Dave Erb, and I'm an automotive engineer by profession, by 36-year career. I teach mechatronics engineering here. I have been teaching since the 80s, though there was about a 10-year period in there where I was a consultant rather than an academic. I came out of the heavy truck and transit bus industry. I'm very much, and I'm trained as an aerospace engineer originally. I also have a business degree that I got at night while I was working. But I'm very lifelong environmentalist and very interested in social justice kinds of issues. I was a member of the Asheville Transit Committee until I term limited off of it. I'm a very strong believer in public transit. And I'm a passionate car junkie, absolutely crazy about cars. And if you think that there's hypocrisy or incongruity in that collection of things I just told you about myself, that might be a great thing to talk about afterwards, you know, in the question and answer period at the end. Both in academia and in industry, I've pretty much my career has focused on energy and emissions improvement for vehicles. I've worked with pretty much any fuel you've heard of, and I've done paper studies on a few you probably haven't heard of, developing vehicles, though it's probably all been fuels you've heard of. I've been involved in about 50 electric and hybrid electric vehicle development projects in my life, and about a dozen of those I would call mine. I have very significant amounts of blood, sweat, and tears invested in those dozen or so vehicles, and so they're kind of mine. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from with this, is a person who has studied not only the vehicles themselves at a very close level, but also where they fit in society and where the energy that we use for them fits in society. And so I want to start off today with just a little bit about why we do the electric vehicle thing and electrified vehicle thing in the first place. But I want to move pretty quickly from that. When I talked to Gene about doing this talk, I said, you know, there's all sorts of mis and disinformation out there. Most of what you read and hear on TV and such, you can't trust. And so if I'd been in person with him, I think his eyes would have lit up, but what I heard was his voice lighting up. He said, oh man, that's what we librarians are all about, is information literacy. How do you sort through information when you don't know that it's necessarily valid? And so that's what I mainly want to talk about. I also want to talk a little bit about moving forward, where we, you know, kind of a roadmap for where we go from here. But I've got lots of time scheduled for open discussion and questions, and so my preference would be that we treat this more like a conversation. I'd love it if you would interrupt me as we go. If you get too tangential, I might defer you to the end, but in general, I would love it if you would interrupt me as we go. Is that fair enough? Good? Okay. Again, like I said a minute ago, I view electric vehicles very inclusively. And so I've been working with hybrids since 1986, but they first showed up in the passenger vehicle market, the personal vehicle market in the US in December of '99. The Honda Insight hit the US market. Very quickly, it was followed by the first generation Toyota Prius. The Prius had actually been on the market in Japan for almost 2 years at that point. But those vehicles are what engineers call charge sustaining hybrids. They don't have a plug on them, so they're really, in fact, they used to advertise them as the electric car you never plug in. And so they're really, if you think about it, they're gasoline vehicles that use electric components to burn that gas more efficiently and more cleanly, lower emissions. And really, emissions are the big deal. There's lots of cheaper ways to get fuel economy than hybridizing vehicles. We have hybrid vehicles in the US market for emissions reasons. It's hard to get good mileage and low emissions simultaneously. That's why we have hybrids. But there are really good reasons to plug in. There are lots of societal and operational, and just it makes a better vehicle when you plug in. And so 11 years later, to the month, we saw the first plug-in vehicles in the US market. It was the Nissan Leaf, which is a pure battery vehicle. You plug it in and that's the only way you put energy on it. But the other one that came on the market the same month is the Chevy Volt. And that's a plug-in hybrid. So you plug it in and you can drive 40-ish miles on electricity, but then when the electricity gets too low to keep your performance where you want it to be, or it's just too low to keep going, the car shifts over seamlessly to gasoline. It's a plug-in hybrid, and so it kind of addresses the issue of how far you can go on a battery by having an engine and a gas tank on board. And there are really good reasons why these cars are on the market. Or there are good reasons to put them on the market. The electric motor is about the best device you can imagine for powering the wheels of a land vehicle. Steam engines come close, but they're not, even they aren't as good as an electric motor. But the reason they're on the market, again, is emissions reasons. California Air Resources Board, if you hear me talk about CARB, I'm not talking about a carburetor that mixes fuel and air. I'm talking about the California Air Resources Board. CARB had a zero emission vehicle standard in their California emissions law that pushes for cars with zero mobile source emissions. So if you don't have a tailpipe, you don't have any emissions. They needed some cars that didn't have tailpipes. That gets brought up a lot as a problem. People will try to say, yeah, but all you're doing is moving the emissions. All you're doing is moving the energy consumption. And you are, in fact, doing that, but I will state categorically, you are also reducing the global level of emissions, and you are reducing the global level of primary energy consumption when you move to electrified vehicles. And this is true not just for charge-sustaining vehicles like the Prius, but also for the plug-in vehicles. People in my business spend a lot of time talking about the field-to-wheels energy cycle. So we start at the oil field, the coal field, the corn field, wherever it is you're getting primary energy. We follow that energy all the way through all the conversions it has to take to get to where the rubber meets the road. And on that total cycle, electrified vehicles are cleaner and significantly lower energy consumption. They're dramatically cleaner, and they are still significantly lower total energy consumption as well. Maybe by a factor of 2 on the energy consumption, maybe by a factor of 4 or 5 on the emissions. But they are also a very disruptive technology. They disrupt a lot of structures in society today, and people go out of their way to protect the status quo. And so I'm going to focus just for this slide on the Chevy Volt. This is kind of the lightning rod of plug-in vehicles in terms of what happens in the public discourse. If you've been paying attention for the last 6 years, you have heard that a Chevy Volt is the stupidest car you can possibly imagine because it only goes 40 miles and then you're stranded by the side of the road with a dead battery. But that's probably a good thing because if you went any farther, it would spontaneously erupt into flames. But what do you expect when that Stalinist dictator Barack Obama forces this communist entity, Government Motors, to sell this car that nobody wants, so they have to take a $40,000 loss per vehicle, right? You've heard that. It's out there. And it's all lies. There's a tiny grain of truth in every one of those things, but every one of those things is a lie. And I know in most settings, I don't know about you as a group, but in most places where I'm talking to groups, that word lies really makes people uncomfortable. We don't like to call a lie a lie. And I'm convinced that that's because there's a taboo about calling people liars. And so, that becomes very personal then when you're calling a person a liar. But the fact of the matter is most of the people telling these lies are neither lying nor liars. They've heard the lie from a source that they trust. It resonates with some kind of a worldview that they have in this day and time. That worldview is very likely to be political. I shouldn't say probably, but very likely to be political. But it also may not be political. It may be something that their 6th grade science teacher told them. And it may even have been true 50 years ago when they were in the 6th grade. That's when I was in the 6th grade, so that's why I pulled that number out. But the fact is they're not true now. The things that they're hearing are not true now. But you've heard it from a source you trust. It resonates with your worldview, and guess what? You're hearing it from sources you don't trust, too. If you're an NPR listener, you're hearing it from Fox, too. If you're a Washington Times reader, you're hearing it you're reading it in the Washington Post and the New York Times, too. And so if everybody's saying it, it must be true, right? 96% of the people who are out there are not liars, but they're telling these lies. And I use that number very intentionally. That's not a random number I pulled out of thin air to say, to use as a synonym for most, okay? 96%, when you subtract it from 100%, you get 4%. And 4% is the fraction of the American population that sociologists think are sociopaths. And these are the people who very aggressively take the tiny grain of truth that's in every one of those stories, spend a lot of time and effort constructing a lie around that tiny grain of truth, and then very aggressively push it out into the public discourse. And when somebody like me comes along and challenges them, they don't back down. They're not like scientists who publish a correction in what is out there. They double down. They come back with an even bigger lie and a lot more aggressiveness. They attack your professional standing. They attack your competence. They attack a lot, whatever they can attack. And that's 4% of the population are sociopaths. They have no compunction about doing this. That's who's really pushing these lies out there and then getting them retold by basically innocent bystanders who just don't know any better. Now, I personally have I'm rarely going to say, look at Wikipedia instead of the Merriam-Webster dictionary, but this is actually a case where I say, go to Wikipedia, because this definition of lie really has a shortcoming in my mind. You don't have to tell an untruth to tell a lie, to lie, right? You can take true facts and string them together in a way with intent to deceive that you are in fact lying. And that's actually what the best paid of the liars are doing. They're taking things that are true, but they're spinning them in a way that is intended to deceive people and have them draw a false conclusion. And in some cases, they're so good at it, they write press releases. If you take one comma out of the press release, you have changed the truth from a true statement to an untrue statement. And it's fairly common. It's very common out there because there are trillions of dollars at stake in the disruption here. How many people here have heard of a Toyota Prius? How many people have driven a Toyota Prius? How many people own a Toyota Prius, right? Do people want that car? Yeah, I mean, it's pretty obvious if you look on the streets of Asheville, our city, you know, this city's cars, the official car of Buncombe County is probably a couple of things. It's big trucks and SUVs, it's Subarus, and it's Priuses or other hybrids, right? So people obviously want Priuses, right? People want charge-sustaining hybrids. They're out there in large numbers. And so I forgot to say, I don't really make a distinction between the size of a lie. In my world, there's no such thing as a little white lie, okay? I personally believe the intent to deceive is so insulting that there isn't such a thing as a little white lie. They're all big, ugly, green and purple and festering lies. But I realize that I'm not necessarily in conjunction with the entirety of American society in that view. But I am going to draw a distinction here in places where things are just out and out lies and others are just really bad shading of truth. And one of those is the notion that nobody wants plug-in vehicles. And I just realized I forgot to get my pointer. So nobody wants these plug-in vehicles. They're just somehow this thing that is forced upon the market by government demand. And they are on the market because of government programs. Make no mistake about that. But they are staying on the market and they're sold the way they are because people want them. So if I look at the blue line there, that's the first 5 years from December of '99 until end of December of 2005, when the charge-sustaining hybrids hit the market. That's the blue line down there. The green line up there is plug-in vehicles starting at December of 2010. So 11 years offset, but it's the same point in the development of the vehicle market. And it's important to understand that little drop there in the 5th year for the plug-in vehicles is because people were anticipating a second generation of cars coming out on the market, like, for instance, Steve's Prius Prime. There's a whole bunch of very compelling cars that either have just recently come out or will very soon come out. And so that drop-off in 2015 was due to just due to people waiting for another car. In 2016, we went up to 159,000, almost 160,000 cars sold, which gets you back on track for the way that the charge-sustaining hybrids went. And this year, I bet my house will sell over 200,000 this year. It's probably going to be more like 250 or 300,000 this year of plug-in vehicles. So the notion that nobody wants these cars is just total nonsense. It's just not reality. These things are taken off at a grand rate. And the more people that have them, the more their neighbors hear about them and the more they buy. They tend to show up in clusters in neighborhoods where one person in the neighborhood buys one. They come over, they get some of these myths and lies dispelled by the person who's actually living with the car, and the next thing you know, you got 5 cars in the neighborhood. Another story that's really patently false is the notion that the electric vehicles will crash the electric grid, that we somehow are going to be putting the strain on the electric grid. That's utter nonsense. In fact, the exact opposite is what's going to happen. This is a graph of a day in the life of California. The entirety of California is managed as, well, I shouldn't say the entirety, most of California is managed as one electric grid with an independent system operator. This is the California Independent System Operators Day on March 2nd, 2007. The red line is both the actual demand for electricity and the actual generation of electricity. Electricity is the ultimate perishable commodity. You generate it, it is consumed. And you have to generate it exactly the right amount at exactly the right time every second of every day. And so that red line is both demand and generation. The green line up here are the available generating resources that could have been called on if there had been demand for them. And then and there's a couple things about this I'd really like to point out. One is that the graph doesn't start at 0. You start at 21 gigawatts and you only go to 31 gigawatts at the top of that peak right there. But and the other thing about this graph is it's March. It's a fairly benign time of the year for electric generation in California. And so in the summer, what you would see is the red line would come up a ways. It'd still have pretty much this shape. The green lines would go up a ways, but that peak right there is going to get a lot closer to the green line at the worst day in August in California. But in spite of that set of green blocks right there, I've marked that out in a way that's what it takes to charge 3 million electric vehicles to travel the amount they're probably going to travel in a day in California. And so I didn't snuggle all those blocks down in close to this, but that's what you would do. The power company would come in and find some way, even if it weren't natural to charge at night in the off-peak time, which is the totally natural thing to do. Even if it weren't, the power company would find ways to incentivize you. They give you a cheaper rate for your electricity in the middle of the night. And so they will shape the curve. They'll take those 42 blocks there and they'll snuggle them down in here. They'll snuggle some of them in here so they don't have this big ramp right here. As one of the things they're struggling with in California right now, there's a lot of solar on the grid. And so it causes this curve actually more recently starts to have a little belly in it in the middle of the day at noon. They call it the duck curve. And so they'll find ways to get people to charge in there to bring it back up. What the power company will do is they'll find ways to use that load, because that load can happen 22 hours out of the day. You're driving your car maybe 2 hours a day. And so that load can be placed wherever you need it to be placed. They'll find a way to make things smooth out much more. That'll make your power bill go down. That'll make their plants last longer. There's all sorts of advantages to that. Another place where we get into the realm of really aggressive lying. People like a simple answer. Everybody wants one number. They want to say, well, how much money am I going to save? You know, how much more efficient am I? One number. And of course, those of us who are specialists can never say that. We say, well, it all depends. And that irritates the people who aren't specialists, or who, we're all specialists. That irritates the people who don't share our specialty, who don't want all the data. But as soon as you give them the one number where you made the assumptions, the next thing that happens is they say, well, yeah, but what if you're charging at night? What if you're in Kentucky versus California? What if? And so with electric vehicles, that becomes a very important question. And about 5 years ago, I think it was, maybe 6 now, because this was published in early 2012, the Union of Concerned Scientists decided we're going to answer that question. We're really going to go out there and we're going to look at the nation as a whole. We're going to recognize that the grid is not one grid. The electric grid is 22 subgrids in terms of the way it's controlled. And so we're going to break it up into those 22 subgrids. We're going to look not at the average for what's happening. We're going to look at the marginal kilowatt hour in the middle of the night, or in the off-peak times, I should say. And so they're making an assumption that you're going to charge your car off-peak, and so you're going to represent load with whatever's there off-peak, and that's what you're going to be ramping in now. And so you got to go with that set of emissions, that set of energy consumption. The other thing they did, they assumed a Nissan Leaf, I should add, in terms of this study, because that's a pretty representative car of a lot of market niches. And so they went in and they made that assumption. The other thing that this reflects is that this study was about greenhouse gas emissions. That's what excites most people these days. I actually get a lot more excited and concerned about criteria pollutants, noxious emissions, than greenhouse gases. But what people respond to these days, and a lot of law responds to these days, is greenhouse gases. So they recognize that when you burn a hydrocarbon fuel, say gasoline, you're turning hydrogen into water, and you're turning carbon into carbon dioxide. And so if you have a limit, or pardon me, if you know how much fuel went in, you knew what the fuel economy was of that vehicle, then you know exactly how much carbon came out, and vice versa. So what they did is they looked at the carbon emissions that are associated with the power plants, and they referenced that back to what does that mean if you were driving a gasoline car. What would be the comparable gasoline car? So they drew this map where they've got 3 levels of equivalent miles per gallon for the gasoline fleet. The dark one is 31 to 40, the middle blue is 41 to 50, and the light blue is 50 miles per gallon. Now I look at that graph and I say, man, electric vehicles are great. This is a phenomenal situation, because I have the data, I know what those data mean really well. I've spent a career studying them. Probably 19 out of 20, I'm not exaggerating, 95% of the articles that I read in the newspapers and that you would see referenced on broadcast journalism said, if you switch to an electric vehicle, in a majority of the states in this country, you are doing worse than if you would just buy a Prius. Now what they're doing there when they say that is so totally dishonest, and this is the narrative that's being pushed out there, in spite of the fact that that was never Union of Concerned Scientists' intent, and that was certainly not an honest read on the data. But what they're doing, they were taking the fact that, oh, here's that little corner of California that's in the Arizona-New Mexico subgrid. We'll count that, because this is a Prius. This light blue is a Prius or better. Right? And so they'll count that, and they'll say, in California, there's a state where you'd be better off buying a Prius in terms of greenhouse gases. And there's other places like here, like, those 2, well, that one doesn't matter. There's one, there's a section, there's a whole bunch of little corners of states. They counted every one of those states, and they said a Prius is a plug-in vehicle is a bad thing because you'd be better off driving a Prius. These were the same people, I might add, who 11 years earlier were telling you it was stupid to drive a Prius. Okay, their motive didn't change. They just had to change their tune to catch up with what's actually out there. Now I've got a couple of beefs with this. The first one is 31 to 40 miles per gallon is the worst section of this graph, but the average new personal vehicle in this country gets 25 miles per gallon. Even in foggy, fuming, fetid, filthy Colorado, how do you like that reference? What you're generating 2/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions that you would be generating with the average U.S. vehicle, average new U.S. vehicle. In the worst place in the country, a place that's actually quite a bit worse than Kentucky, I might add, my southeastern Appalachian roots coming out here to the fore. So that's my first beef with this graph. The worst on here is better, far better than the average existing. My second beef is it doesn't account for time. That study was published in early 2012. 2.5 years later, Union of Concerned Scientists repeated the same study, but updated it. And in that time, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Florida, all, Texas and Florida, big population, lots of cars, they moved into the lightest blue zone. This whole area of the upper Midwest moved from the darkest to the middle. California went from 78 to 95 miles per gallon equivalent. The grid gets cleaner over time and instantly makes every car charging from it cleaner. This is very different than a typical car. You change the car itself, it takes you 20 years to turn the fleet over before you see the full effect of the technological change.
Is that solar power coming in?
It's a bunch of things in different places. It's different things. In Texas, it's mostly wind. In California, it's wind and solar. In Arizona, New Mexico, it's wind and solar. There are other parts of the graph that I think changed. Florida's probably not either of those. It's probably natural gas. So it depends on where you are.
Yeah, I assume natural gas would be a big factor, but also as far as greenhouse gases, is the methane contribution to greenhouse gas here, or is it just
that I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer to that question. I suspect it is because Union of Concerned Scientists is really pretty daggone good, but I don't know the answer. So don't hold me to that statement. They usually do cover their bases pretty well, but I don't know. My third beef with this is a greenhouse gas map. If we were to draw this map for noxious emissions, for criteria pollutants, our worst section would be the light blue, and we would need probably 2, maybe 3 cleaner, lighter blues to describe the best places in the country. The electric vehicles have been a slam dunk on noxious emissions, even with coal plants, since the 90s. So it's those 3 issues I have are pretty serious with the misinterpretation, the intentional misinterpretation of this study. How many people have heard the term range anxiety? No? That's interesting. That term is actually, when you read an article about electric vehicles, it tends to be out there. And range anxiety is the notion that you're worried because you're going to run out of charge. And market researchers have looked at electric vehicle drivers since, well, for 20 plus years that I'm aware of, and probably a lot longer than that. But I mean, they've had them under a microscope for 20 plus years that I'm aware of. And what they find is people who actually live with electric vehicles do not suffer from range anxiety. There's a few people, Rudy Beharry, who directs the math lab, is one, who are always kind of creating their own range anxiety. They try to make trips to Raleigh in a Nissan Leaf that only goes 84 miles on a charge, that sort of thing. So there's lots of people out there who put themselves intentionally in those positions, but other people don't. Most of us don't intentionally put ourselves in that situation any more than we do it with our gasoline cars. And so range anxiety really is a non-issue with people who have experience with the cars. And that really shouldn't surprise anybody. If you look at the way we use vehicles in this country, about somewhere between 15 and 20 years ago, Georgia Tech instrumented a whole slew of cars in metro Atlanta, personal vehicles. They weren't just cars, they were pickups and SUVs and such too, minivans. But they instrumented these cars. They had just extensive data on them. They had GPS so they could tell exactly where they were and how fast they were moving, basically in full time, every second by second. And they knew things like, was the key on or off, because they wanted to be able to distinguish, are you sitting in a parking lot or is this just normal Atlanta traffic, right? If you're sitting still for 30 minutes. And so they knew when the gas cap came off the car. And so that's a data set on conventional vehicles, but it's an extensive and amazing data set. And some researchers up at the University of Delaware took that data set a couple years ago and looked at it with an eye towards what it means for electric vehicle uptake. And so there's zillions of graphs in this study, but this one I really like. The horizontal axis is vehicle range. How far did this car go in a day? And then the vertical axis is saying, well, how adaptable are people? How many days a year are they willing to change their behavior in order to account for the fact that this car is a little different than what they're used to? And so the contour lines then are the fraction of the fleet that falls within those combinations of driver flexibility. If I've got a driver who is totally inflexible and they drive 600 miles in a day, you know, I have to get way out to here to appease that person. That person will tolerate 1 day a year that they'll change their behavior. And yet that's the corner of the map. And if I look at that, then I've just arbitrarily said drivers are not very flexible. They're going to be willing to change 1 day a month, no more. And so that's my blue line that I imposed on this study. Even if drivers are that rigid, the new model of the Nissan Leaf gets 107 miles. It could have covered almost 75, it could have replaced almost 75% of the cars that Georgia Tech watched for almost 3 years. 400 cars made it through the test where they didn't get crashed or moved out of the state or any that sort of stuff. And so 400 cars made it almost 3 years in that to make it into that data set. And so 3/4 of them could have been replaced by the current first generation Nissan Leaf like Steve drives. The Chevy Bolt, which is now on the market, there is at least one in Asheville, though you can't buy them here yet, could have replaced every single vehicle in the entirety of Metro Atlanta if this data set is a representative data set. So, you know, worrying about range is kind of a non-issue, and it's really important to understand how rigidly this study defined adaptation. It was very strict in its definition of adaptation. If you trade cars with your spouse for the day, that's an adaptation. If you charge at a place that is not your home, so for instance, if you charge at work, that's an adaptation according to this study. And so I want to kind of get you to the second chapter of this fictional creation called range anxiety. There's electric vehicle charging stations everywhere you go. There's 4 of them right there. Okay, I can plug into any standard household socket and put 5 miles an hour back into my car. For every hour I'm plugged in, I can get 5 miles range back in my battery. If I go, if I go to Ingalls or the Steak and Shake up in Weaverville or any number of other public chargers, those are a higher level charger. You can put about 4 times as much, about 20 miles range back in your car for every hour you're plugged in. And that's going to cost, at the level 2 chargers like Ingalls, that's going to cost about $1 an hour for the person that's providing the charger. They love the notion of you spending an hour in their store. That's why the charging is free. They do not charge you, there is no fee involved in this charging because they'd love it if you'd spend an extra hour in their store. That's why the Steak and Shake has it. They want you there buying another malted. A coffee shop wants this. And this was totally predictable because even back in the 90s, if you've seen Who Killed the Electric Car, even back in the 90s, with 800 EV1s, which was kind of the focus of that movie, there were any number of places across Southern California that installed chargers to attract those 800 people to come do business with them. And those were much more expensive chargers, I might add, than what we have now. So, you know, we're going to see electric vehicle charging everywhere in a matter of a couple of years, and most of the places that are going to offer it aren't even going to charge you a fee for it. But it's really interesting to me, in keeping with the focus of today, this term, range anxiety. I've been working in this field for 36 years. I've worked specifically with plug-in vehicles since 1991. 26 of those 36 years, I've been working specifically in this field. I had never heard that term until 2010, and bang, all of a sudden it is everywhere. And there's a reason for that. This is General Motors' trademark application, and I say that as a person who, I need to tell you, General Motors are among the good guys now. They have not always been the good guys in this field, but they're actually some of the best corporate citizens when it comes to the transition to plug-in vehicles right now. This is where they attempted unsuccessfully to trademark the term range anxiety, to use it in the ads for the Chevy Volt, because they knew they were going to be fighting the Nissan Leaf for the same customers. And so there were two things they did back then. They refused adamantly to call the Chevy Volt a plug-in hybrid. That's because they'd been part of the people who had very intentionally, it's part of a very large group of bad actors who very intentionally had made hybrid a dirty word about 11 years earlier, right? And this is, again, this is not paranoid conspiracy theory. This is a bunch of people. It doesn't take a conspiracy when you've got a bunch of people pulling in the direction that maintains the status quo that they already live in. And so that's, range anxiety is a fabrication. It was actually intentionally created as an idea to place in people's minds. So as we go forward, if you haven't figured out, electric vehicles to me are part of how we go forward. But the most important thing for us to do is as Americans, as North Americans, we live in a great situation. We have access, we have wealth. I would not be making these same suggestions if I were in China or India or somewhere like that. But as North Americans, if we want to maintain the access that we have now, that we enjoy, that's valuable to us, the first thing, the most important thing for us to do is to reduce our demand for motorized travel. We just need to find ways to drive less. And I'll give you, I don't want to sound like I'm bragging or anything, but my wife and I, when we moved here, we cut our driving by a factor of 3 just simply by where we chose to live. And now that a couple of elderly relatives have died, it's been cut by another factor of 2. So our driving has been cut basically by a factor of 6 just through intentional choice of how we structured our lives. And you know, buying a house is a pretty important thing. It doesn't happen very often, but 1/6 of Americans move every year. And so every one of those moves is an opportunity to rationalize your life so you can drive less. The other thing you can do is take advantage of that cell phone you got, right? You don't have to jump in the car to go find out if the store has what you want. You can call them. And that goes a long ways to reducing demand for motorized travel. Motorized travel per capita has went up between 1950 and 2007 by a factor of 3, over 3 actually. And so there's, people always want to look back at the 50s and say that's when life was good, right? Well, one thing we might want to do is drive less like they did back then. Second thing we need to do is use our vehicles more productively, and that could be using a smaller vehicle to carry the same load, or it could be consolidating loads to fill a vehicle better. Carpooling is a perfect example of that second strategy. Third thing to do is to electrify the vehicle trains to the extent it's reasonable. There are vehicle missions. It's not so much the vehicle as it is the mission. There are vehicle missions where electrification is probably going to be relatively slow to happen, even in its ultimate end game, it probably is not going to be total electrification. But to the extent that it is feasible, and with passenger cars, it's extremely feasible. In fact, with motorcycles, you'll get a better, or motor scooters, let's say, you'll get a better vehicle by electrifying than you get with gasoline. And then finally, we need to use renewable energy for as much of that electricity as we possibly can. And I'm going to argue that at this stage in American development, North American development, we should be really hammering on distributed photovoltaics. That's the really important path at this point in time. So if you want a way to remember those 4 steps, just picture a motor scooter and a solar panel. If I've got a motor scooter I mean, I'm sure there's some nut job who is the exception to what I'm saying here, but I'm not making 100-mile commutes on a motor scooter every day, right? There's probably somebody who does it, but they're a lunatic. So that vehicle is going to kind of implicitly reduce your demand for motorized travel. The second thing that vehicle does is it's about perfectly sized for its load. It carries 1 or 2 people, a bag or 2 of groceries. That's what it can carry. And so it's really well sized. It's matched to its load. So that's the second step. The third thing to consider is even a fully highway capable electric motorcycle that can run on the freeway with a 600cc bullet bike is going to use about 100 watt hours per mile to drive that vehicle, 100 watt hours of energy per mile traveled. That's a third of what a gasoline scooter uses. Just to give you an idea, a Prius uses 7 times that much energy. And so by electrifying, especially these smaller vehicles, you really see a dramatic benefit in energy consumption. And then finally, a PV panel, a 200-watt PV panel, which is about the size of that sofa over there. The seat of that sofa is a 200-watt PV panel. In western North Carolina, it'll put about 900 watt hours a day on the grid, pretty much every day, yearly average. In the worst places in the country, it'll put probably 600 watt hours a day on the grid. Well, 600 watt hours for a vehicle that uses less than 100 watt hours per mile, that's well over 5 miles a day at a price you can afford. Most middle-class Americans could easily afford that scooter and that one PV panel. And OPEC has no say in the matter. You got clean transportation, energy security, all those great things all rolled into one. And OPEC, big oil, none of the standard boogeymen have any say in the matter. You get to make this choice of your own free will. Nobody puts a gun to your head to force you to do it. You can ignore it all if you want. But this is a thought exercise. This is not a prescription, right? This is a way of thinking about this. If you don't want to take those steps or you don't want to take them to this extent, find the place where you are comfortable with it. That's the way forward. And on that same note, I love this quote. I really don't like Andy Warhol's art at all, but I love this quote. You know, people say time changes things. People wait for somebody else to change them, but it doesn't happen that way. You got to change them yourself. So my request to you today is take the steps, think about this. That's the most important step. And then once you've thought about it, find the steps that improve your life. It's really great to not have to go to the gas station in the rain. It's really great to not empty my wallet into a gas pump. It's really great to have a nice, quiet car that has really good low-end acceleration compared to a comparable gasoline-powered car. There's all sorts of things that this strategy can make your life better. Choose those. It's like dieting, right? If you hate the food or the exercise is grueling, you're not going to lose any weight in the long run. It just isn't going to happen because you're not going to stick with it long enough. Find the things that make your life better. And on that note, I got to kind of brag a little bit. UNC Asheville is making my life better. There's a group of mechatronics students who are building a Formula SAE car. Specifically, they're building an electric Formula SAE car. There's gasoline. Jordan, are you on that team?
I'm working on it.
Okay. This car is electric. There are 2 classes, electric and gasoline. Just to give you an idea, the very fastest gasoline cars last year at the contest we're going to in Lincoln, Nebraska this summer, the very fastest gasoline cars ran the course in 95 seconds. The electric cars ran it in 90 seconds. And again, you're making your life better. You're getting higher performance, not lower performance by going electric here. And so I'm really proud of this bunch of students. They've done just tremendous work so far, and they're going to do better work in the future. And I can't wait to go to Lincoln in June. So with that, on that note, I'd like to open it up. I've been yakking a mile a minute here. Questions, comments, observations? Thank you. Yeah.
You mentioned people doing things of their own free will or because they don't like OPEC or whatever, but I find that economics is the main motivator among people. And you're not as concerned about greenhouse gases, but as you are noxious gases. But if we were to have a carbon tax, so there was just a cost, or alternative, a savings, you get paid
Yeah,
to use electric.
I understand the concept, and as a guy with a business degree, I understand the notion that it is right. I think the place, I'm not a big proponent of a carbon tax, and again, I'm not arguing against it by any means. I think it's better than not having one, to tell you the truth. But I think you have to look at price elasticity. Gasoline is one of the most price elastic, demand inelastic commodities out there. If I raise the price of gas, if I change the price, if I raise the price of gas by a factor of 2, I only cut consumption by 5%. And so, can you put a high enough tax on the carbon? Politically, is it possible to put a high enough tax on the carbon to have a significant impact? And I'm skeptical. So that's the big one. The flip side of that story, though, the optimistic side of that story, a 5% reduction in demand for gasoline knocks out half of the cost. It doesn't reduce oil industry revenues by 5%, it reduces them by 50%, and the difference stays in people's pockets, even the people who are driving gasoline vehicles. So there's a tremendous ability we've already seen this a little bit with the fracking in the Bakken Shale and such, the North Dakota oil fields. That has put supply on the market, which has cut the price of gas in half. And OPEC almost, the people I know in the oil industry in Houston say, what's wrong with those OPEC people? Well, it's kind of like being in a traffic jam. If you're putting if you're complaining about traffic in a traffic jam, you need to look in your mirror. The traffic would be less congested and flowing more smoothly if you weren't there. And that's the same way I feel about the discussion about fracking and how the prices are so collapsed that people can't make any money. Well, that's not just OPEC, that's all those frackers in North Dakota, that's the investment bankers in Houston, everybody. And in fact, what we've seen is it looks like the OPEC consensus on scaling back the demand is not going to hold. They're going to continue to cheat because countries need cash flow. And so we have tremendous power as consumers with electric vehicles to reduce demand, which reduces oil industry revenue, which I'm going to get blunt. I don't know if this is okay on company time, but if you want to stop the flow of oil industry money into government, the best way to do it is to stop the flow of personal money into oil industry, right? Steve?
Yeah, I was just going to say that in terms of pricing, carbon tax aside, as someone who just bought, thanks to Volkswagen's fraudulent emissions scheme, because we owned a fraudulent Volkswagen, and with the money they bought our car back and the penalty money, we bought new plug-in cars. And with a $10,000 off coupon right now on the Nissan Leaf.
And that has been extended, by the way. I don't know if you know what he's talking about, but Nissan the factory is slapping $10,000 on the hood before you go to the dealer. You start negotiating.
So I got a brand new car for $21,000, including sales tax. And there is a $7,500 tax credit for a plug-in car. So that car effectively costs like $14,000. So even if the Trump administration disappears that tax credit, it's still $21,000 for a brand new car. And the new Prius Prime combination plug-in and hybrid costs less than a plain Prius did 10 years ago. The price of this technology has come down.
With the tax credit, the Prius Prime is cheaper than the base model Prius. And in the next week, within a couple of days, you're going to see Chrysler out there really making a big splash with the hybrid version of the new Pacifica minivan. Well, what they almost never tell you in what they're planning to say is that's a plug-in hybrid. It's a 30-mile electric range car or minivan, and it's going to be in a similar situation. It will, with the tax credit, the hybrid version, the plug-in hybrid version, will be cheaper than the base model. And so if you're in the market for a new minivan, that's kind of a no-brainer right now.
I was wondering about the batteries, like for these cars, is like 1,000-pound battery, right?
Yeah.
And like the lifespan, like how long does a battery last, and like the waste comes to throwing the battery away after?
Well, first off, let me get to the last comment first, and dramatically. You're not going to throw it away. If you take your Leaf, when you need a new battery in a Leaf, which is not going to happen for 200, 300,000 miles, it's going to last the life of most first owners of the car. But when you do get to that point, and you take your Leaf to the dealer and you say, I need a new battery, they say, give us $6,500, but then they reach in the other pocket and they hand you $1,000. They have a $1,000 core charge on the battery that they won't give you a new battery if you don't give them an old one back, because they're going to take that to Tennessee to their battery factory and they're going to recycle all that material into new batteries. And it's worth $1,000 to them to get it back. It's actually worth more than that. That's what they'll give you for it. So we're not going to see that material, shunted off to landfills and things like that.
Do you know about how much of it has to be thrown away? I mean, is it?
It's very little. And actually these vehicles, plug-in vehicle batteries have been designed from the get-go to make it even smaller. But what most people don't know is that the regular starter battery in your car, that's the most recycled product in the industrial world. Something like, I don't know the exact number, but it's over 95% of that material makes it back into the industrial stream. The only thing that doesn't is when they shred the polypropylene case, there's a little bit of that shredder fluff that can't be recycled. It really is landfill material. But everything else, the acid, the lead, the case, everything in there, almost everything in there, makes it back into the industrial stream. To give you a kind of a reference point, we recycle less than 50% of aluminum cans. Okay, and so the lead acid starter battery is actually the most highly recycled product in the industrial world.
The type of battery that's used in?
Yeah, these are lithium-based batteries in all these cars. But again, the difference between them and the lead acid starter batteries, these have been designed from day one with a thought of recycling, because not so much for the US market, but the European market, the European Union demands cradle to grave responsibility for cars. The manufacturer is responsible for where all that material ends up when the car's used up. Gene?
Crystal ball day, if you could gaze into it. I know that with like the hybrids, Toyota expanded to other models, like they put it with the Camry and the RAV4. Looking down the road, what kind of other diversification or changing existing kinds of cars do you see happening?
Well, that's a great question, because I see it going everywhere, frankly. But the place where it would be most useful is going to be the last one we do it. Because the place where it's most useful is a big ass pickup, the gigantic SUV that people are signifying, right? And so that market has been intentionally trained and very aggressively, intentionally socialized to hate the notion of hybrid and electric. And yet that's the market. If I take a 10 mile per gallon vehicle and turn it into a 15 mile per gallon vehicle, that has a much bigger impact on total gas consumption than turning a 25 mile per gallon vehicle into a 30 mile per gallon vehicle. This is actually, you might have heard me when I quoted energy consumption numbers. I don't like to use fuel economy. I like to turn that number upside down and use energy intensity. So I'll talk in terms of watt hours per mile rather than, or if it were gasoline, it would be, gallons per mile rather than miles per gallon, because now I can see how much it takes to get to zero. How much difference am I really making? And I don't see that as easily. Going from 50 miles per gallon to 100 miles per gallon cuts your fuel consumption in half. But going from 10 miles per gallon to 20 miles per gallon cuts your fuel consumption in half, and the base was a lot bigger to begin with. So The last market I see going there is trucks, SUVs. But we're, again, within the next week, Chrysler is going to be out there with plug-in hybrid in the minivan market. And you're going to see a lot of people who went away from minivans come back to them. That's a marketing thing. People made it uncool. There's one of my very favorite auto writers is a guy who writes for the Wall Street Journal named Dan Neal. He's actually an NC State graduate and lives in North Carolina now, but he's written for the LA Times and the Wall Street Journal. And he had a great entry. He was reviewing a Mazda minivan once, and he said, I've never really understood why people who are minivan people feel the need to deny that they're minivan people, right? And he says, one thing you can pretty well count on if you're driving a minivan is you have kids. And if you have kids, that means you've had at least some measure of success with the opposite sex. That's a lot more than you can say for a Corvette. So anyway, so minivans have been uncool for about the last decade, right? People have wanted crossovers and SUVs and such. They're about to become cool again, and part of it's going to be this Chrysler push to get people in a plug-in car. If now all of a sudden, my wife is a case in point. We don't have kids, but my wife hates going to the gas station. She will do anything to bring the car in on the last fumes and make me take it to the gas station. And she would tell you this too. I'm not speaking out of school to Kent's camera there. Kent has no blackmail potential there. But there are a lot of people who really don't like to go to the gas station, and so now all of a sudden all your minivan type errands can be done without going to a gas station. And I think they're going to sell a ton of them personally. So, other comments, questions?
If you're going to have photovoltaics doing a lot of the charging for electric vehicles, doesn't it make sense to be able to, especially as the percent of the total grid capacity becomes photovoltaic, to be able to use those batteries for residential storage of energy? Yeah,
in fact, you're going to see a lot of people are looking at second life for batteries. Think about the way your starter battery, when it goes bad, it didn't really die on you, and you go out one day and you turn the key and it's the coldest day. It's always the coldest day in February when you turn the key and it goes clunk, right? And you say, damn battery died on me. Well, no, it's been getting sick for a long time. And back in August, you turned it and it took a couple extra cranks. And in September, it took a couple more cranks. And you just decided you're going to wait, right? And you waited till it just died catastrophically at a day where it really did inconvenience you. But with electric vehicles, it's the same thing happens, but it becomes important sooner. So you go out and you find, gee, I used to have 100-mile range, but now I've only got 95. You find that the acceleration on the on-ramp is just slightly degraded, and that gets to the point where it's unacceptable long before you go out and the car just won't go anywhere. And so there's a lot of life left in that battery at that point. And so I know BMW has a big effort on this, but they all kind of do. They're looking at second life. They're looking at taking those batteries, and before they send them to a recycler, what they're going to do is find a way to reuse in a stationary setting where those things like the ability to accelerate down an on-ramp aren't nearly as important.
Yeah, I would like to see the ability just to use the storage capacity that's in the car.
Oh.
Integrated with it.
Okay,
Which warranty is
yes and no. And there is a lot of talk about that too. They call it V2G, vehicle to grid. And so there's lots of work. In fact, the folks that did that Delaware study are probably the nation's biggest experts on V2G. But I don't see V2G as really having a good business case for it. And the reason is that the numbers that they're projecting right now, they're talking about using the cars in the frequency regulation markets in the electric utility industry, but that's a market that only has just a couple people who can play in it. You know, Duke Energy with all the storage they have down at Bad Creek and Lake Jocassee, they can play in that frequency regulation market basically at zero cost. So they can bid $30 a megawatt hour into that market. But if all of a sudden now I've got 25 aggregators of electric vehicles who can bid in that market, suddenly that $30 a megawatt hour price, which is a pretty typical price in the frequency regulation markets, suddenly that price collapses because there's too many bidders now. There's other people besides Duke who can bid to provide that service. And so I don't see, most of the studies I've seen of V2G focus on the present price that you can get in the frequency regulation market. I see that price collapsing the minute you have two aggregators of cars to play in that market. And so, but that's not to say there's not a lot of value. The real value is as a dispatchable load to the utility. So a customer who pays money for the electricity, but who doesn't need the electricity at any given second. They got 22 hours a day that they're not driving that car, and they can tell Duke, hey, I'll let you charge my car at whatever rate you want as long as it's ready for me to go to work next morning. And so Duke gives you $25 a year that they'll pay you for the right to cut your water heater out for very short periods of time, 15 minutes max in the deepest, coldest morning of February. They'll give you $25 a year just for the right to do that. And you won't even notice it happened. And they do the same thing for the heat strips on your heat pump. They'll do the same thing for your air conditioner. So you can actually, if you have the right combination of equipment, you can get $75 a year out of Duke by giving them the right to occasionally, and it really is almost never, turn off your appliances to balance their load. From Duke's point of view, it's a lot better to have somebody who's going to buy electricity from me, and I can shift it. I can move it 15 minutes to get it out of that peak period. And so, and it's also a lot more electric load than they're going to, in terms of the total electricity that they're dealing with, that they're going to be dealing with. So I see a tremendous market for dispatchable demand, which is a new concept, basically. We can dispatch load, but it means getting rid of demand for that period of time. But if we can just shift demand and make that dispatchable, that's really valuable to a utility. So.
This might be slightly outside the scope of your talk, but I mean, one technology that always seems 5 years down the road is the hydrogen fuel cell. I mean, yeah. I thought you might get that reaction. Is it ever going to do what EV cars do?
No.
No.
And that's a very controversial statement, okay? I have just this week been abused online for a statement that was a lot less definitive than that one about this topic. But I've got some colleagues who work at the University of Alberta up in Edmonton, and they love to joke around. They say, yeah, Canada's the premier country of the next decade and always will be. and that's my view of hydrogen fuel cells. And don't get me wrong, fuel cells are wonderful devices, okay? They're a great device for taking a hydrogen-rich hydrocarbon like natural gas or methanol or ethanol, if you've got a supply of those things, stripping the hydrogen out of it and then using it in a very efficient, very clean way. So for instance, if I'm running the hospital and I want to do cogeneration, I want to generate electricity and I can use the heat, the waste heat byproduct, and I've got a 24/7 need for that waste heat byproduct. Now a fuel cell looks like a great thing. I can slap it right on the roof of the hospital. It's relatively quiet if I design it to be relatively quiet. They aren't always quiet, I might add. It's not the fuel cell itself, it's the ancillary equipment that's loud. But that's a great use of a fuel cell. But what's being promoted out there that you're seeing most of the hoopla about is elemental hydrogen as a fuel for cars, and it's usually being touted as this is a way we're going to buffer intermittent supply from windmills and solar panels against the intermittency of demand, which we want to drive when we want to drive. We're going to make elemental hydrogen, store that, and then we'll have buffered those two intermittent pieces of the puzzle through that storage buffer. But the amount of energy, hydrogen is not an energy source. It doesn't exist in nature. Elemental hydrogen is one of the most reactive things you can find. If you know, an H2 molecule is wandering along and it sees some oxygen, bang, you got water. If it sees a little sulfur, you smell rotten eggs, right? And so it does not want to exist in that form, and it takes a lot of energy to put it into that form. And so and it takes a fairly sophisticated plant to put it into that form. If I've put the billions of dollars into a separation plant to get hydrogen from whatever, I'm not gonna let that plant sit idle all night because the sun's not shining. I'm going to insist on a nuclear power plant, and that's actually the reality of hydrogen economy is it's a nuclear economy. It was and ever will be a nuclear economy. It came out of the national labs, and especially in the 90s when the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union crumbled. We had to find a way to keep those folks at the national labs working, but they're atomic people, they're nuclear people. They don't want to work on Partnership for a New Generation Vehicles, which was one of the things they got put to do. They want to go back to their real calling. And so they are the place where all the materials science knowledge of how to handle hydrogen exists. And so it was an idea that had come out of the national labs in the 50s, and here now they got another shot at it at a time when they really want to go back to atomic work, and it wasn't happening. And so they're the people who really were pushing it more than anybody. But it's too expensive of a fuel when you get down to it. It doesn't offer you a significant advantage over what is very easily doable with battery vehicles. And so I just don't see it happening. So, how we doing? My pleasure. If you can't tell, I love this topic.